We'll put a map up of Ohio congressional districts because you have to look at these to really appreciate how very clearly they are not designed to sort of follow communities.
Well, and we didn't even talk about Akron, which is divided into 4 congressional districts and yet does not have a single member that actually lives in Summit County where that district is located. Where you're like, okay, so you have 4 congressional districts and actually not a single member lives in the county.
Oh yeah, the 11th is really weird looking too, which is one of those Akron districts.
They call that one the LeBron district. And works its way down to Akron. Now that one is a little odd looking, and that's because it's the one majority minority district that we actually have here in Ohio. So it has, a little more than 50% African American. And so, like I said, pretty is as pretty does. There are going to be some that are a little odd looking simply because they are attempting to correct, historical misdeeds.
Yeah, and I think that's an important thing to mention when we're talking about gerrymandering is that there are a lot of things that people are trying to accomplish, even with the best intentions when they are drawing maps.
I've spent a lot of time thinking about the folks that are worried about partisan advantage. But the other thing to remember is, we need to have, one person, one vote. That actually they need to be equal in population. And then there is, that goal of having these majority minority districts because, we have a history of voter suppression and suppressing African Americans winning elections, sometimes Latinos winning elections. And so there's some districts that are going to look a little weird, but there is actually an advantage to them. And it can be, a minority majority district, or something can look a little weird. And it's just because the populations need to be nearly equal.
So each congressional district in the country right now, except for possibly the ones in states where there's only one, is about 700,000 people in each district. So there can be lots of different ways to draw those lines and get that number.
Well, absolutely. And, one of the things that we would like to see is a focus on keeping communities together. And that, in fact, we would like to participate in real elections. We have, public records where we were able to see that 12 of those districts were drawn to favor Republicans and 4 of them were drawn to favor Democrats. And it was explicit in what the map makers wrote. And then that's what happened, 12, 14, and 16. And so you have to say what happens with the map makers and what the map makers decide have more to do with who gets elected or who you send to Washington than your vote, there's a real problem.
So I know that right now there is an issue on the ballot in Ohio coming up for a vote in May about redistricting. Can you tell us a little bit about issue 1?
So issue 1 was placed on the ballot by the state legislature. So I mentioned that citizens came together. We collected more than 200,000 signatures. And these were people who were not paid canvassers. These are folks that said, hey, there's something really broken and we need to do what we can to fix democracy. And let's collect a bunch of signatures so that we can address gerrymandering. And that was enough pressure to get both political parties together to say, hey, what do we do to improve the system? And so issue 1, it was, formally Senate Joint Resolution 5. Issue 1 was a legislative measure. And what it does is it creates bipartisan map making. It focuses on creating greater transparency because, one of the things that's really irritating is like in 2011, the map making was done in a hotel room 500 feet from the State House. And they called it, because we did that public record search, we know they called the hotel room the bunker. I mean, it just, you can just, imagine like how hard they worked to make sure that we would have access to what they were up to until after it was actually all done. What's a big improvement in issue 1 is greater transparency and giving citizens the tools so that, in fact, they can make their own maps. And you might say to yourself, well, who's actually going to make maps? Everybody's actually going to want to make maps, but it is incredibly hard to go and testify about how to improve maps that they're considering if you cannot draw slightly different district lines to show what you're talking about. And so, for example, if there is an area, so this is a good example, Grandview Heights, which is a suburb of, in an inner ring suburb of Columbus, is separate from a community that they actually share a school. It's Marble Cliff is the name of it. And they actually are in two different congressional districts. And in fact, if you could go and you could testify and say, okay, these district lines don't make sense because you are actually dividing a community that shares a school district, and you could actually show a map. And so I think that type of participation will actually encourage them to do much better maps. And it allows us to actually be more influential on the process while it's actually happening.
It looks to me like issue 1 has been endorsed by both parties in Ohio, which kind of surprised me because with a lot of the other sort of gerrymandering cases we've been investigating on this podcast, it's been sort of the party that gerrymandered is sort of defending the districts, and the party that has been gerrymandered out of power is fighting to make the districts more equal. But in Ohio, it looks like there's been a lot of people from both sides of the aisle endorsing issue 1. Do you think that this is gerrymandering is a pretty bipartisan issue in Ohio?
So I don't see it necessarily as a bipartisan issue, although right now both political parties support issue 1. It's been, as I say, a long strange trip to get here. So we have had redistricting reform on the ballot in 1981, 2005, and 2012. In 1981, when redistricting reform was on the ballot, the Republicans were completely in favor of reform because, in fact, they were the folks out of power. They weren't the map makers. And the Democrats worked to defeat it. By 2005, the Democrats were out of power, and they were all about fixing gerrymandering. And it was the Republicans who worked to defeat it. And the same thing in 2012. And I really think that one of the things that has happened as we got, to 2012 and 2016 is it became increasingly clear that computerized map making is so precise that it really does marginalize one party so successfully that both parties spend all their time worrying about the primaries. And that ends up worrying both political parties. Mm-hmm. And so, issue 1 of 2015, which was the state legislative redistricting reform, was our first time that people of both political parties came together and worked on redistricting reform. And it's been hard. We live, as we all know, in an incredibly polarized time that both political parties were able to come together in 2018 to actually address congressional redistricting reform is kind of amazing. Mm-hmm. But it's because we've been having these conversations for 40 years.
So do you think that issue 1 is likely to pass?
Bipartisan reform often passes. So, all we have to do is look at some of the previous efforts and previous campaigns. When, in fact, there is good consensus, we are a swing state. And in fact, when there's consensus from both political parties, it makes reform more likely to pass. However, we're having this vote on a primary ballot. And so one of the challenges is that this is the time that people, the most partisan people go to the polls for the primary. And many of the independents that we often consider the swing voters, they can participate in issue ballots. They can come and participate in the election, but they often choose not to. And so I am very hopeful because of this long effort and the support of all sorts of different organizations and both political parties.
If we want to encourage our friends and family in Ohio to get involved, what should we be telling them?
Well, you can go to fairdistrict.ohio.org, which is where you can find the Fair Districts Equal Fair Elections Coalition. On the homepage, there are all sorts of different ways to get involved. For example, you can get a yard sign. You can distribute literature at early vote or on election day. There are all sorts of different events where you can distribute literature. And we're also, if people want to actually walk around their neighborhood and, talk to their neighbors, we can create walk lists and give you information to hand out. So, voters in Ohio, there are lots of different ways to reach out to your neighbor. It can be really fun to have a conversation about, we collect all these signatures, and together, both political parties, we're actually doing something to improve democracy.
Well, is there anything else that you want our listeners to know about your coalition or about gerrymandering in Ohio?
It is incredibly hard to work on a problem that happens every 10 years behind closed doors and is about map making. But it is well worth it. Ending gerrymandering is something that all states should be looking at. I am really interested in seeing what happens with the 2 cases at the U.S. Supreme Court. But every state should be focused on working to make their elections more meaningful. And, for Ohio, it's been an experiment and it's been hard work and it's been challenging to figure out how to work together, but it is well worth it.
Well, that's excellent. And we're so thrilled that you guys are working on this. And I can name at least a few Ohio voters who will be voting for issue 1.
Yes, me too.
Oh, and please consider coming to visit us on Election Day. We'd love to have you join us for our celebratory party.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Does it freak people out when you get visibly excited talking about serial killers?
Do you want to learn how to draw eyeliner wings sharp enough to kill a man?
Fame and Misfortune is a celebrity true crime podcast hosted by Aaron and Stephanie, 2 quirky makeup artists who bonded over their love of makeup and Manson.
Each episode is a pleasant blend of famous murder and the occasional beauty tip.
It's the podcast full of crime, glam, and social anxiety you didn't know you needed. Tune in for new episodes every Monday and Thursday on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you listen.
Welcome back to Two Broads Talking Politics, listener. As usual, I'm one of your hosts, Sophie, and I'm here with Steven Schafersman. He is a retired science professor, still working part-time, and he is a 3-time Board of Education candidate and currently running for county judge in Midland County in Texas. Welcome.
I'm glad to be here.
We're glad to have you. Just to sort of get an idea of where you're coming from, can you tell us a little bit about how you got involved in Democratic politics in Texas?
Yes. It happened with the State Board of Education.
Mm-hmm.
I was evolutionary science professor. I studied the evolution of fossils, and it came to my attention that evolution was being censored at the state level in Austin, Texas, by a group of people on the State Board of Education. I decided to run for the State Board of Education in a district, but I lived in a part of Houston that was Republican, and I lost that. And I ran twice more, and I lost those too. The third one, I ran in Midland, and the district was the entire northwest quarter of Texas. And I had an enormous area where my voters were, and I traveled all over the northwest quarter of Texas. And I did get 140,000 votes. However, that was only 26% of the people in that corner of Texas. It's hard for a Democrat to win. Although we do have some locally, there are certain areas, counties and cities where Democrats can win. So we do have a functioning, active Democratic Party here. But I've been active with the party for many years.
So tonight we're here to talk about gerrymandering. Can you tell us a little bit about the state of gerrymandering in Texas right now?
First, let me define gerrymandering.
Yes,
then
please.
I want to put it into a historical context and a context that all of your listeners can recognize. Gerrymandering is a system that allows politicians to pick their own voters. The states have the power to design their own election boundary and election district. And I'll explain where they got that shortly. Because of that, if one political party can get control of that process, they can design the election districts and boundaries to best suit themselves and their own candidates. And by that means, they can create an artificial majority in elections which they can control. Gerrymandering is effective in House districts, and that would be federal House districts. You can't gerrymander Senate districts because they're apportioned in a different way, 2 per state. You also can't gerrymander for the president and vice president, but you can gerrymander for the House of Representatives. You can gerrymander for state senators and representatives, and you can gerrymander for all local boundaries. So it's quite a powerful technique. If you'll indulge me, let me go through some of the important history here of why we've come to this situation. After the Civil War, there was a 10-year period of Reconstruction. It only lasted 10 years because the party that had